Good morning, Dr. Michael Fisher. Do a video this morning on a topic that really intrigues me, of course. Anything around fear always intrigues me. As a fearologist, dedicated for a long time, I'm always interested in doing a fear analysis of various people's work, various artifacts, various cultural phenomena, various spiritual phenomena, and natural phenomena. The top off topic really, I guess, would be my fear analysis of Naomi Klein and her work. I am only going to do such a brief overlying sketch that really gives a view of how her work, and she's sort of this leftist journalist, very famous writer now, a public speaker, public intellectual, famous for her climate change work and activism, but also just has been a journalist interested in culture for a long time and is becoming an outstanding teacher on how to deal with the future, I think. So the fear analysis will be particularly of her last couple of books, just taking a little few sections in particularly, then bringing it to my work and my interpretive frame, which is how does this author and their work, part of, again, remember this left political cultural movement for reform, change, sometimes called progressive left, progressive education. How does it really work with fear? How does fear management come into the work that Klein, is presenting to us? And is it that useful, or where is its shortcomings? Okay, so that's kind of the topic for today, and get into her interesting latest book that just came out called Doppelganger. Get back to that. That's that whole idea of when you see yourself in somebody else, but it looks like yourself and sounds like yourself. It's also called the double effect. All right, so interesting psychological cultural phenomenon going on, and Naomi Klein has been investigating that, speaking about her new book, Doppelganger, which will be a bestseller, no doubt, in a very short amount of time. My book is also coming out, so I'm going to intro my book very quickly, so I'll do a screen share. New book coming out in 23, probably November. Let's just get it up here. There we go, full screen. So a little short PowerPoint, a couple slides here. We'll start with my book. I wanted to share this with you and just the excitement of, wow, I finally, after 34 years of writing about fear and studying it systematically since late 1989, I finally produced one book on fear in education. So the role of philosophy of education in speaking truths to power in a culture of fear. The fear problem, or fear problematique, as I'm calling it in this book. It's really, what is the fear problem with the fear problem? And I thought I would therefore label it the problematique, just to show that there's actually a problem with the problem of fear. Won't go into that further, and this video is not about my book. I will soon follow up a video. I'll put links below where you can order the book if you want to pre-order it. However, what I show it for is that I'm coming to basically say we are not going to progress in a society, and this is what I say in this book in general, is that our philosophy of education has not caught up with the times. Our general philosophy in culture and society and our just common sense approaches to the world have not caught up with the actual emergent fear problem. And again, as I say, the fear problem with the fear problem. We haven't adequately conceptualized and theorized, philosophically or otherwise, the true depth of the nature of this fear problem we are confronted with. I'll get into that in this talk, some of the implications of what the fear problem has been producing, or the fear problematique. So again, that book is available if you're interested. And I look forward to it really putting my work into the educational sphere, particularly philosophy of education, but also just education period. So yeah, really appreciate if people would get out, critique the book, share it, and let's actually have it make some difference in the way education is going today, which is far behind the nature and role of fear and its massive and quick, viral effects that it's having in growth. So here's the book I really want to get to later in this talk, but I'm going to start with her earlier book. But this is the one that really I just barely reading, and I'm going to actually read a couple pages from this book today. She calls it in the subtitle, A Trip into the Mirror World. And without saying too much more about the book, you'll sort of get this sense that there's a fragmentation in the imagery here. There's a digitalized virtual kind of quality going on where you really can't tell, is this a real human being? Is this just an image of a human being? Or is this actually some kind of avatar? And avatar is, again, possibly, and it's used in digital culture where people create avatars of themselves so they don't have to be themselves, but they can play with the avatar in digital world, and that becomes like a mirror world for them. Naomi Klein's interest in mirror world, you can go see any of her talks online right now. Very interesting just to hear how she defines that. I will go a little bit into the theory behind the mirror, the doppelganger effect, this double effect that is found in psychoanalysis. It's found in a lot of literature and the history of literature and Freudian psychology, etc. Why the double is so important. It's also found in shamanistic traditional cultural understandings of when you get visited by some being that is a double. Okay, well, get into that as we go, but I'll just say this actually is an image of some kind of cross hybrid of both Naomi Klein, as I say, this kind of leftist, hard-hitting activist, journalist, very powerful public intellectual. And on the other side, there's also in this image, apparently, I'm guessing or intuiting, the image of her doppelganger. Naomi Klein began to realize quite a while ago, several years, that people were mistaking her work and writing for Naomi Wolf. Naomi Wolf being a left feminist activist and again, public intellectual, very bright woman as well, coming out into public discourse some decades ago, particularly, and then has been trying to keep her population, and followers interested in her work. But then Naomi Wolf kind of went into directions without the long story and became depopulated, became deleted from the left. The young people and others were no longer liking some of her notions. And then she got picked up and she moved in the direction of the right. So here's where the left in Naomi Wolf started to turn more right and is now, doing regular show podcasts with Steve Bannon, who is the one that helped Trump to get elected for president in 2016 in the USA. Just to let you know, the left and the right and the left getting crossed and mixed. That's a bit of the doppelganger effect as Naomi Klein began to do her research on that. Okay, so we'll stop share. Back to the talk where I'm going to again do some reading from Naomi Klein's work with this fear analysis, and then I'm going to try to hook that to the doppelganger effect more or less. And Naomi Klein does a nice job. She's a very good researcher, a very good person in terms of integrity in their writing. That doesn't mean I agree with everything Naomi Klein says, and I certainly do not. Just to introduce and get to the first book by Naomi Klein, I will just give a little bit of a theory of, quote, where I think in my own work on fear, I also have been, without knowing it and not using the notion doppelganger, I have actually been attempting to get to a theory of a kind of doppelganger effect in understanding the nature and role of fear. In fact, being able to recognize fear, and it gets mixed up and confused with many things. And I'm actually going to show, usually these doppelganger effects, it seems like opposite things come together and mirror each other, and then they become opposite on the other side of the mirror. I'm just giving that gesture so you'll kind of remember that. And that creates an interesting confusion and awakening, even an uncanny experience of what's going on here. Why does love start to look like fear? Why does fear start to look like love? So, for example, that's a big part of my work and theorizing. And it's provocative, and I am controversial in my thinking. There's not a lot of people that think like I do, but there are some. But to get back to where I got really intrigued in probably the late 1990s, when I was doing my dissertation work at the University of British Columbia in the education faculty, adult education at the time, and then into a PhD in curriculum and instruction at the UBC. I was attempting to show to educators that we really are behind in understanding the nature and role of fear, and it's quick changing, it's morphing, it's shifting, it's evolving. And it seemed to me that the fear management strategies, both of the culture and both of what I would find in the literature in educational psychology, educational philosophy, and sociology, were quite far behind what I was seeing in others in the field of sociology, for example, or anthropology, for example, or geography, for example, politics, for example. They were much more advanced and progressive and inclusive, theorizing about fear and how it was impacting so negatively, for the most part, for society in general. So what happened, why educators were behind, of course, interested me, and were they afraid to look at fear itself and its huge impacts, its growing fear problematique. I found a quote by an educator, a critical pedagogue named Peter McLaren. And this is particularly important because I'd always kind of admired Henry Giroux, Peter McLaren, coming out of the critical pedagogy school of Paulo Freire and others, and this movement to really critique society in a very deep, fundamental way, and that we ought to use education forces and practices in a good way, not an obsessive ideological and fear-based way, but use education in a good way to bring about very positive changes, but mainly to help people adapt with the world. That's what good education is. Can you adapt to where the world is going and the future we're heading into? Peter McLaren made a very important quote in a dialogue he had with someone seemed like a Latino theorist at the time. And in this book is this quote that I put in most of my articles, and it's in a footnote in this book. So I'll just read it in my book, this particular book. Not that we have to go into the title, anything further into that book. But the footnote is, a great discovery for me, Fisher, in these years was the writing of Peter McLaren, a postmodern education philosophy and theorist, where he came up with the concern similar to mine, but labeled it in an interesting way. He saw the increasing fear in culture, especially in the USA in the mid-1990s, and its peculiar and different nature, which he describes as follows, quote, "We are witnessing the hyper-real formation of an entirely new species of fear," end of quote. Other than myself, Fisher, no other author or educator has since picked up on this exact declaration by McLaren. Not even himself does he recite that phrase, hyper-real formation of an entirely new species of fear. So I began to then get very concerned. Why is that not being picked up? That is a profound statement on fear. And I, again, have reproduced that quote many, many times in my work. Again, nobody picking it up, no educator repeating it or asking questions about it. There is just like this big zero. Leave that behind as an intro. Now I'm going to go into Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein, in this particular book, which is the first one of hers that I actually took a lot of time to look at, this changes everything. And you can see the opposites of capitalism versus the climate. And you could also say that is culture versus nature versus culture, however you want to put it. And Naomi Klein arguing in that book that humanity has been in this enemy position. So this is not new. Many other theorists have said that, but there's an enemy making going on between how humans or culture interprets nature and tries to manage nature. And many people would today, including myself, would say it's been more or less a long-term slow turn toward the disasters, even though there has been some good progress of human change, evolution, technologies. It's not all bad. It's not all good. I then am going to model and diagram, show you this. I wrote it this morning, that I'm very interested in how nature and culture do seem like opposites, and the way they interact, especially from the perspective of, I'm talking now a modern perspective. I'm not talking from an indigenous perspective in the old ways in which people lived in culture, but very closely connected to nature. Nowadays, and I'm saying basically through the last, let's just say 500 plus years or more, there's been a dissociation. Some people say 5,000, 10,000 years ago, the natural world and the culture world split more and more and became opposites in a way where cultivation, agriculture, modernization, industrialism tried to basically control and end nature, is kind of an argument. I think we need to look at this through a mirror phenomenon. So that's why I drew this diagram, that the natural world does always move in and with the cultural world. The cultural world sometimes dominates, and then again, the natural world will start to dominate back to the cultural, and there's a cycle spiraling dynamic. So I'm mapping a dynamic here just in a very general way. And I argue that inside the in-between part of that dynamic turning is a spiritual world that we also need to tap. Now let's get to this. I'll explain that differently in the next model I built this morning, very briefly. And this is the dashed line between the two. I've always kind of liked this dialectical movement that is opposites, and how are they going to relate to each other? And they can split even further, or they can keep integrating like this and move in a dialectic, which would be a healthy condition, rather than just splitting off and having only cultural or only natural as the top value and the most important reality, etc. But this mirror is what I drew here. I said, I think we are now in a state where nature and culture are mirroring. I think nature and culture have always mirrored from the beginning of the evolution of culture from nature. But the split became to the point where they became opposites, as I'm saying, particularly today in most of the world. And that could be climate and capitalism. If you looked at Naomi Klein's title and made the analogy, yes, opposite seeming of intentions and values. And so I just called that mirror world, which is the term that Naomi Klein came up with in her book. And again, I haven't read her book in detail to know exactly why she used that term or where it comes. I'm sure she's not the only one that's used the idea of a mirror world or mirroring, and the dynamic of it for actually being helpful and or a way to diagnose disease pathologies in the systems of life, existence, whatever we want to call it, and look at. Get to the next diagram after I read a short passage from Naomi Klein. Let's get to her real words. And the reason I really started with this book is that it really gives you a flavor of this person, a mother as well, coming into the future. So this book, and she's written many books, but this book was very unique, she says. This proposes a different strategy to change. Think big, go deep, and move the ideological pole far away from the stifling market fundamentalism that has become the greatest enemy to planetary health. You can hear, right? Nature versus this culture, and capitalism that is marketized culture to be a particular kind of culture of consumption in excess. Naomi Klein goes on, if we can shift the cultural context even a little, then there will be some breathing room for the sensible reformist policies, means progressive policies to her, a leftist policy agenda, that will at least get the atmosphere carbon numbers down and moving in the right direction. Anyways, then she's sort of confident that she can do this or accomplish this with the climate change movement, the movement against global warming, to try and get us to a sustainable planet again, and so on. But then she sort of says there are, of course, no guarantees that a more systematic approach will be any more successful than all these piecemeal attempts of activism, climate policy changes that have been largely ineffective. Though there are, as will be explored later in the historical precedents of history itself, that there are grounds for some hope. So a little bit of hope. She's becoming more cynical and pessimistic in her years of studying the human problems of humanity against nature, capitalism against nature, and so on, culture. Because the research has led me for this book to search out radical responses to climate change. I have no doubt this is the hardest book to face because I had to face the biggest truths. And in that, she then goes on, it's been a hard book to write for several reasons. I'm going to get to her talk. I'm at the end of her intro. It's kind of her, introduction. And then she's going to really dive into fear. But you can start to hear she's going to creep toward, so I'm on the second last page of the introduction. It's been a harder book to write for personal reasons too. The researcher, right? The public intellectual, the journalist, the serious scholar, she has a PhD, and the personal mother with a child. Here we go. What gets me most are not the scary scientific studies about melting glaciers, the ones I used to avoid. It's the books I read to my 2-year-old. For example, Looking for a Moose is one of his favorites. It's about a bunch of kids that really, really, really want to see a moose. They search high and low through a forest, a swamp, in brambly bushes, and up a mountain for a long-legged, bulgy-nosed, branchy, antlered moose. Quote. The joke is that there are moose hiding on each page. In the end, the animals all come out of hiding, and the ecstatic kids proclaim, "We never, ever seen so many moose," end quote. On about the 75th reading, she jokes with her child, it suddenly hits me. He might never see a moose. I tried to hold it together. I went back to my computer and began to write about my time in northern Alberta, tar sands country, where members of the Beaver Lake Cree Nation told me about how the moose had changed. One woman described killing a moose on a hunting trip recently, only to find that the flesh had already turned green. I heard a lot about strange tumors, too, in these animals, which locals assumed had to do with the animals' drinking water, contaminated by tar sands toxins. Mostly I heard about how the moose were simply gone. And not just in Alberta. Quote, here's a title, Rapid Climate Changes Turn North Woods into Moose Graveyard, end quote, reads a May 2012 headline in Scientific American magazine. A year and a half later, the New York Times was reporting that one of Minnesota's 2 moose populations had declined from 4,000 in the 1990s to just 100 today. Pessimism is easy to come to, species extinction, climate change, and really what seems to be a spiral of super hyper technoculture consumerism taking over to the point of, will there be anything left under all the waste from all that consumption? But on the last page is what I'll read now, is her short couple points about why I've never seen this in her work, but it's coming out in this book. Again, her toughest book, right, to write. That she was a mother who was very frightened, if not terrified, of the future for her son and for life itself. When fear, like that, used to creep through my armor of climate change denial, she admitted being a climate change denial. She didn't want to know all the facts about climate change. She was studying other problems in the world, economic justice, social justice. I would do my utmost to stuff it away, that fear, change the channel, click past it, not watch the news. But now I try to feel it. It seems to me that I owe it to my son, that as we all owe it to ourselves and one another. But what should we do with this fear that comes from living on a planet that is dying, made less alive every day? First, accept that it won't go away. This is her prescription. That it is fully rational response, this fear, to the unbearable reality that we are living in a dying world, a world that a great many of us are helping to kill by doing things like making tea and driving to the grocery store, and yes, okay, having kids, especially when you're in the first world, developed world. Next, use it, she says. Fear is a survival response. Fear makes us run. It makes us leap. It can make us act superhuman. But we need somewhere to run to. Without that, the fear is only paralyzing. So the real trick, the only hope, really, is to allow the terror of an unlivable future to be balanced and soothed by the prospect of building something much better than many of us had previously dared hope. Yes, there will be things that we will lose as climate activists. Luxuries some of us will have to give up, whole industries that will disappear, and it's too late to stop climate change from coming. Because the thing about the crisis is big, this is all encompassing, is that it changes everything. It changes everything, where we are going, and climate change has been doing this. What is challenging is to democracy itself, something she writes a lot about, and other critics have it as well, is that in this amount of stress, distress, fear, culture of fear, climate of fear, climate of disasters and crises, these cascading crises of all kinds that are going on in the world, is there still this big problem? And I'm going to now move to a deeper level of the problem of democracy being able to actually function anymore. And many of us know what is being basically arising in many countries in Europe, particularly, but other parts of the world, but now in America, especially since 2016 and Trump's election and the MAGA movement and other extremist conspiracy groups, movements. But it's also conspiracy theory movements on the left as well, and the extremes. Remember these polarizations. And then they start to look like each other. In a moment, I'll get to her book, Doppelganger, and read a few pages from that, and then we'll end the video on a summary of that. The Fear Problematique is that we now enter the problem of belonging and othering. Belonging being that which is the good, right? Where we feel that we all belong because we're human citizens. Nobody should be othered and made so different that they do not belong anymore. And democracy sits right in the middle of that. And yes, it's a little bit my other diagram. This is normal, this is cultural, this is spiritual. But I want you to focus here for the moment, because this is my theorizing of and my analysis that I'm going to go into in Naomi Klein's last book. Is I finally came up with realizing that I'm taking a course on belonging and democracy right now, and it's very interesting just to view from the angle of a fear analysis, which the course does not do, but I'm doing it of the course, the critic that I am. And I began to realize, well, belonging is often represented by love. So I have the L up here. And othering is represented by the fear of difference, fear of the other. Very common phrase and understanding. Many people use that language. But many people do not necessarily understand this dynamic that I'm arcing out here. That there's a movement from belonging to othering back to belonging again in this spiral dynamic, which I'm really interested in. This is probably how reality works. That's my theory that I'm putting forth here. And love is the same. We move from love into more fear, fear back into love. You don't want to get stuck at either end. They need both in a dialectic way. But that would be a healthy system. An unhealthy system would be everybody's trying to belong in their various specific identities. We have identity politics, which is polarizing heavily. It's the symptom of polarization. A polarization happened a long time ago with the othering that went on, where people only wanted to belong to the sameness, and anything other was, let's get rid of them because they're a threat and an enemy. Long story, but you all kind of know that. I would imagine if you're watching this video, othering can be very vicious. It doesn't mean that we aren't acknowledging there's differences, but it's acknowledging when that difference and you make them an enemy, or you make them an animal less than human, for example, or you make nature less than sacred. And therefore you can abuse it, destroy it, bring genocides about to get rid of the other. What I want to focus on just very briefly, and the theory of this love-fear dynamic, just again with other terms here, you could use other terms as well, is that I said, oh, I finally got the symbol for love and fear. I've been working on the symbol for love and fear. I always said, well, everybody sort of recognizes the heart and, you know, the nice red heart, for example, and, oh yeah, love. And it's like a universal symbol that's spread around the world. I don't know where it started, but it's got a lot of power, right, to represent love. And everybody likes to promote it and look good, send out hearts and Valentine's days, and we're loving. Yeah, right. But in a culture of fear, that love is not so simple. It is not so straightforward. And in fact, it's got an empty, weak spot. That's why I left the shading out of the heart. And I went, oh, yeah, that's the potential virus that's in love for it to not be so healthy and good. And it can actually be pathological when it moves. Loving your sameness with the other, loving sameness to the point of not loving the other at all anymore, it breaks, it fragments, right? The relationship once was love. We loved each other, and then we divorced and cracked and fragmented and killed each other in some kind of psychic way, or even real ways, as you know, lovers can do. What happens is this dynamic is that then fear starts to also get a heart, because people start to love fear in a certain kind of way. They'd rather live in fear than live in love and intimacy anymore. They don't trust it anymore because it cracks and it breaks and it's hurtful. There's a lot of suffering, that love that cannot be brought to flourishing and maturity, and it immaturely cracks and dies. So fear becomes the love object, not because people want to, not because our nature wants to, but it's because it's sort of the option if you don't want to go back to love and belonging again and trust. So that's how a society and our personal psychology arguably operates, and fear would be empty of all that goodness of love. What I put in just filled in dark. I could have done it in red. I didn't have a red crayon. Particularly, I wanted to do it in a different color just to show you there's a theory here, and the love is not pure. It's tainted. And we could use post-traumatic theory for why that tainting is there. We could use that fear has always been part of the love problem. And there's a fear problem and a love problem on this planet. Okay, so I'll end moving more to the mirror world and the theorizing that I will do as a fear analysis. Naomi Klein's theory, just to be clear on fear there, her prescription, she doesn't really have a theory. fear. So that's my first critique, my fear analysis of Naomi Klein's work. She doesn't have a fear theory. She just articulates, like I just did that reading. It really is just very simple, basic psychology that you would get, and that is not adequate to in the understanding of the fear problematique and what she's actually writing about in the great wicked problems of the day, which she's very interested in all these different wicked problems, social justice, economic, ecological justice, but she doesn't really understand the full impact of the fear problematique. And she doesn't do the research on it. She certainly doesn't quote my work. And so all of the problems of making a prescription for how to handle and manage fear are, is it adequate? We have to ask that question as a fear critic, as a fearologist. Yes, I do, as a fear analyst. And that's what I would like to engage. So is her doppelganger book, doppelganger, what's the subtitle? Yeah, it's living in the mirror world. Does this book, her latest, theorize deeper into the problem of this mirror world? And I've showed it that mirror going with those dotted lines across in those two dynamics theories I just showed. Is that going to be a useful theory to understand the doubling of how one side starts to become the other? Whether it's the left wing, the right wing, they start to look and sound the same. Love starts to look like fear, fear starts to look like love. You could argue MAGA, Donald Trump, that extremist, many people call fascist movement, is promoting a huge love, a love for freedom. And in many ways, Donald Trump shows that love as a leader, a grand leader. And it's appealing to people. They feel loved by his way of being in the world, his interpretation of the world and where America ought to go. MAGA means make America great again. We love America. Oh, yeah. So this is, again, the mirroring distortion of who loves America more. And I would say, from a fear analyst, who fears America more. And this is where Naomi Klein doesn't quite get to that depth. But let's read this piece, then maybe I'll have some more comments. This is just some place in the book I grabbed middle way, quarter way near the end. Many people whose cultures, lands, and bodies have been targeted in these ways recognize the logic behind Hitler's political project precisely because it was familiar. She explains this now. After Kristallnacht in 1938, for instance, a delegation from the Australian Aborigines League wrote a protest letter condemning, quote, the cruel persecution of the Jewish people by the Nazi government of Germany, end quote. And in a little-known historical chapter, hand-delivered that to the German consulate in Melbourne, Australia. The consulate refused to accept it. This is historical fact. This was well before Western governments were willing to confront Hitler, make it public. In other words, what he was doing was the extermination of the Jews and others, capital O, others. Yet these indigenous leaders, who were still fighting for basic rights of their own, they know oppression and genocide, clearly saw the gravity of the threat. The Nazis' industrial killing was new, and the Jewish case is different. But Klein says, but so is every case different. But, and some things are all too similar as well. In other words, the past and the future are in a mirror relationship. Get to it more. You can hear her theory of the mirror world starting to slip through of why it's so important as an analytical tool for today. The flip side of the post-World War II cries of, quote, never again, end quote, was an unspoken, quote, never before, end quote. The insistence on lifting the Holocaust out of history, the failure to recognize these patterns, mirrors, and the refusal to see where the Nazis fit inside the arc of colonial genocides have all come out at a high cost. The countries that defeated Hitler, the Allies, you're speaking about, the countries that defeated Hitler did not have to confront the uncomfortable fact that Hitler had taken pointers and inspirations on race making and on human containment from them, leaving their innocence not only undisturbed, but also significantly strengthened by what was indeed a righteous victory. She's basically saying Hitler didn't get his ideas from nowhere. Colonialism, genocide, exterminations of the other have been going on in Western countries in the European and prior to the European empires. Nothing new. This is a point Lindquist makes in a critique. Quote, two events need not be identical for one of them to facilitate the other. European world expansion, accompanied as it was by shameless defense of extermination, created habits of thought and political precedents that made way for new outrages, finally culminating in the most horrendous of them all, the Holocaust, end quote. And one of the hardest habits of thought to shake is the reflex to look away, to not see what is in front of us, and to not know what we know. That was Klein's comment, which I would say that is definitely a fear-based reflex she's speaking about. It's when we fear the fear of our own fear and how it operates, our brutishness, our ugliness, our dangerousness to life. When Lindquist wrote, quote, exterminate all the brutes, end quote, it was the early 1990s and the climate crisis was barely in his sightlines. He did not yet know that European powers and their settler colonial states would spend the next 3 decades effectively deciding to let continents where those of, quote, inferior races reside burn and drown, because once again, the alternative interrupted the flow of limitless wealth accumulation. We let them burn, we let them drown under climate change. Other countries, so I'm saying we, the dominant Western world, so-called developed world. We must now ask this question. What if full-blown fascism is not the monster at the door, but the monster inside the house, the monster inside us, even we, whose ancestors have been victims of genocide? She is Jewish herself. This, I fear, is the deepest danger posed by the mirror world and its increasingly belligerent war on history. The door to the Shadowlands was cracked open. Truths were flying out that would no longer be contained. The most abused shadow workers in our economy, immigrant women and men on temporary work visas, laboring in 4 care homes in a single day, or packing chicken parts in impossibly cold and bloody facilities, were finally on our television screens. Not because they were being cheered as heroes, but because they were the ones in the so-called hotspots, the ones whose bodies were piling up in morgues and refrigerator trucks. We had no choice but to see and to reckon with what had been so long hidden and repressed. Then, when so many of us streamed into the streets that first COVID spring and shouted the names of the murdered, and then one after another, we bowed our heads in grief for the little ones who never returned. More truths were escaping. Like that couple in the pre-Raphaelite painting, more and more of us were beginning, just barely to see ourselves and our place in a larger world crowded with spectral presences, doppelgangers. For some, it made us faint. For some others, it made us mad. For a great many, it made us want to change, to expel the monster inside the collective unconscious, or at least try. Try to be the kind of people whose daily lives do not require the annihilation of other lives and other ways of life. Quote, forces opposed to justice stand steadily and ready to reverse the gains of yesterday's struggles entirely should the opportunity present itself, writes Ololefene Taiwa in his book Reconsidering Reparations, published in 2022. By then, the forces of forgetting were already roaring back to slam the door and to shroud our countries in innocence and righteousness once again. Quote, there is resistance to memory inside memory itself, quote, writes the historian of psychoanalysis, Jacqueline Rose. This resistance to memory inside memory itself, resistance to remember our shadow past. And the argument, psychoanalytically not surprising, Klein is citing a historian of psychoanalysis here, Jacqueline Rose. The repressed, the denied, the non-remembered will return if it is a memory that is stored in trauma, repressed, denied, fear-based. One more story that brings this fear analysis to a close. 1 year after the announcement about unmarked school burial grounds in Kamloops, the New York Post ran a piece quoting an influential conservative ideologue and a longtime opponent of Indigenous rights, Tom Flanagan, who called the revelation of the graves, quote, the biggest fake news story in Canadian history, end quote, and a case of, quote, moral panic. So both the right and the left, if you do any research, create moral panics. They don't mind doing that to try to influence people, right? Moral panics, you create some kind of great disaster of some other, whether it's a virus or whether it's criminals or whether it's people from a different nation, immigrants, etc. A moral panic, sin, right? And you then use that fear to then manipulate and say, well, follow me, we'll go the right direction morally. Unlike that other immoral direction. So both the left and right use moral panic to manipulate and use it as power to get influence. But neither of them critique their own creating of the moral panic. And this is the point. They always say the other people are creating the moral panic. So the right wing says that all these left activists, these green activists, Jordan Peterson is one of those, and he continually critiques the left for creating moral panics. And then, of course, the others on the left, they're critiquing the right wing and their conspiracy theories, saying they're creating the moral panic. But if these truths are stuffed back, the truths of history of the shadow man she speaks about in the unconscious, individually and collectively, they will keep haunting us and keep reemerging in the mirror world in distorted, twisted forms. So the last bit of the quote here ends this chapter. On May 14th, 2022, an 18-year-old white supremacist obsessed with the Great Replacement Theory, which the white supremacists use. The Great Replacement Theory and low birth rates among whites drove to a Tops supermarket, Buffalo, New York, with the aim of killing as many Black people as possible. He murdered 10 people with a legally purchased AR-15 style rifle. He live streamed the massacre as others had before him, performing himself as his generation had been taught to do. He left a long, rambling manifesto behind, praising Nazis and calling himself, among other things, an eco-fascist. Julian Brave, Noisecat, a writer and colleague from the climate justice movement, colleague of Naomi Klein, noticed some uncanny parallels at work here. Uncanny parallels, meaning doppelganger effect parallels. So here's citing Julian Brave's article. I'm struck by the similarity of right-wing conspiracy theories to actual policies towards Indigenous peoples. Replacement theory, manifest destiny, QAnon, mass institutionalized child abuse, boarding and residential schools, pandemic, smallpox, alcohol, bioterrorism. No, it still continues to go. It's all so Freudian. The fear that it will happen to them stems from an implicit admission that they did it to others. Very important point there. As though the Black, brown, and indigenous downtrodden are just as hateful as they are and are going to turn around and do to them what they did to us. Now back to Naomi. Is that part of what we are seeing? Are increasingly violent conspiracy theorists in the mirror world afraid of being rounded up, treated as second class, occupied, and culled because on some level they know that these are the genocidal behaviors that created and sustained their relative but increasingly precarious privileges? Are they terrified that if the truths of the Shadowlands, past, present, and future, are ever fully revealed and reckoned with, that it can only result in a dramatic role reversal, mirror effect, with the victims becoming the victimizers? Good little bit of fear analysis on her part, Naomi Klein there, in showing this terror, deep terror that all the injustices done and those in the privileged position who've helped accumulate, accompany, benefit from those oppressions and the extermination, the horrid violence of them, to genocide. When they know it and they see the uprising of those victimized coming to get back and try to get their justice back, whether it's reparations of Black people in America, which is now on the agenda and plate of Marianne Williams, for example, who's running for president 2024, and some others, that then there's like, well, if they get the power, right, the victims get the power at some point. The great terror is that they will do the same to us as we did to them when we were in that. So you can see the mirror as they do the shifting. It's just like my diagram with the arrows, the victim and the victimizer. But that aerodynamic movement that I'm just talking about, and she's talking about, is victim and victimizers. Will they come back with the same revenge and treat us like we treated them? Well, that is exactly what Nelson Mandela and his reformation when he came out of prison, working with Bishop Desmond Tutu, and really was led by Tutu, the whites and the blacks reversing, right, their power in government, at least officially. Although in the culture itself, that probably still was a long ways from ever being repaired. The Tutu and Nelson Mandela and that government that took over when the blacks first took over after the British left those power positions and turned the state back to the Black Africa, in Southern Africa, that they said, we will not do that revenge. We know it's very possible. We will not complete and keep that cycle of trauma going, that cycle of fear-based ways of being, of othering, creating belonging, but only belonging when we other those who don't belong. And that could be black on the top, white on the top, right? That's the fear. It's a great terror. And it's deep. That's what she's getting to. And so when your other shows up and has more power and shows up to you and you start to see, oh, why is this person or why are those people starting to take power like I've got power, right? So they're actually mirroring your power. They're mirroring some, even the way you talk, because they want to come up to a particular place of non-victimization. But that becomes the doppelganger effect, and it terrifies people at the first reaction to the double, meeting the double in the mirror. That is the opposite, but looks the same, starting to look the same, too much to look the same. And what Naomi Klein is saying, this is really the digging into the fear analysis, is she's saying we're so afraid of letting that double come up and meet and be in a communion, a democracy, in a listening justice space, an ethical space. The terror is too deep because the fear inside the dominators is that they will be victimized like they victimize those who are coming up. Politics is in a huge mess because of this. Cultural othering, identity politics works all along that same dynamic, arguably. That's the end of my talk today. Look forward to your comments on that, and keep the conversation going about belonging, othering, democracy, nature, culture, love, fear.